companies are now so powerful, so important in American politics, pumping money into US politics, it just becomes a political problem for us to try to deal with them properly. I do kind of hope that, I think this is immensely bad PR for Elon Musk. And I think we've kind of got ourselves into this place where we think we live in this nihilistic, anarchic world where you can do whatever you like and it doesn't really matter anymore. I do think public opinion is probably swinging quite severely against Twitter, and whether that means that we're eventually able to ban it, I'm sceptical.
Let's start with what's going on with X and Grok. I know this has been much discussed, but it's bottomless. The government has taken aim at big tech with the announcement that non-consensual sexual deepfakes are going to be criminalised. This, of course, comes after concerns about Elon Musk's Grok AI being used to digitally undress women, which there's been much fuss about. Some people are calling it a free speech issue. Some people are simply saying it is a kind of sexual abuse issue. I guess the place to start here is, Megan, how incredibly odd that non-consensual sexual deepfakes were not already criminalised.
Yeah, it is very odd, but I think, as is the case with a lot of AI content, it's moving a lot faster than the government and regulation is able to keep up with. I think what's particularly interesting about this is what Elon Musk has done, which is basically put it behind a paywall,
right?
Which doesn't really seem like a good solution. You know, you can
pay for this and it's fine.
Yeah, exactly. But I think it's definitely causing a bit of a headache for the government because obviously Elon Musk, not famously a fan of Keir Starmer, posts quite a lot about him. But I think there's a lot of pressure from Labour MPs, you know, to do something about this. They're continuing to sort of have to be on X, but I think that actually they're not really necessarily getting the engagement that makes it worthwhile. So we had a story in the New Statesman yesterday, which was, I think, from a Labour staffer who was basically sort of saying, you know, we're continuing to post on this platform that has all these horrible aspects to it, not getting much engagement, but actually we've been told, the quote was, we've been told to make memes that appeal to Gen Z and the chronically online. So
right. It
sort of seems like it's quite bizarre that we're having this conversation about a platform that is sort of behaving quite ridiculously in sort of the manifestations that are kind of coming out of it.
There's so much in this story. I mean, so Elon Musk's protest about his sort of response to people saying that it's outrageous that Grok is doing this. He's saying, well, there's plenty of tools that do this. And to some extent, he's right. You know, other AIs do this kind of stuff. Photoshop can do this kind of stuff. Once you start thinking along those lines, James, you start to think, well, hang on, maybe Renaissance painters were basically producing their version of non-consensual sexual deepfakes, in that they were sort of, you know, putting aristocrats' faces and sort of undressing them as Venus or whatever. But then, I don't know, maybe there's just a real flaw here in trying to adjust the paradigms we've got used to over centuries of human thought to this new AI age. Maybe they just don't work.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're kind of grappling with what it means. In a way, I think it usefully makes some of the evils of social media a bit more explicit. I think we seeded this unfortunate point years ago, which is that we decided that social media companies weren't going to be treated the same way as publishers, and that what Twitter publishes isn't treated the same way as something a newspaper publishes. I think as it gets more extreme, the kinds of stuff that's on these platforms, the weirder that rule looks. I mean, some of the stuff that's now published on Twitter, if we tried to print it in the Times, I don't think this newspaper would exist for very long. And I think the more extreme and the more crazy it becomes, the more we're going to have to look again at our fundamental idea of what social media is and how we treat it, because they have to have some responsibility at some point. And part of me kind of hopes that it's now so mad, it will begin to swing opinion against it to what I viewed as the common sense position all along.
See, I mean, one reason why I really, really struggle here is I know exactly what I think about this, and it's exactly what I've thought for years, and it's a completely useless thing to think. In that, what I think is basically, it is generally outrageous and really, well, if not outrageous, then really, really troubling when you have any kind of state-mandated rules on speech, on what can be said online and what can be said in any kind of context. I'm really, really against government putting restrictions on free speech, except for reasons of maximum sort of public safety. However, the flip side there is, the way you stop that from happening is by having tech companies behaving with responsibility about the kind of stuff that they allow, because they can do what they want. They can censor, they can curate, they can do anything, because they're private organisations. And when they don't, I find I have no idea what to think at all. Megan, what do you think?
I mean, I agree. I think I'm slightly cautious on putting any sort of restraints on freedom of speech, but I think with the whole Grok deepfake thing, it does sort of veer into completely new territory, because it's sort of like, you know, women putting up photos, completely sort of innocent photos. I think I saw one woman had put up a photo of her at the gym, and suddenly people are replying, sort of, numerous people replying to her, asking Grok to put her in a bikini and things like that. So I think that just does seem to take it one step too far. But I agree, it's sort of, as journalists, we're always slightly, cautious about this sort of government encroachment on freedom of speech and things like that. But I think this is such an extreme case, and it will have a sort of effect on women posting as well, because are women going to want to post photos? I certainly don't want to post a photo of myself anymore, knowing that someone could go and reply and say, put Meghan Kenyon in a bikini. I don't really want that to happen. So, that is in turn encroaching on my freedom of speech. So,
when Patrick Maguire and I interviewed Nigel Farage last week, we were manipulated online, a photo of the three of us, in all kinds of exciting ways, which I'm sure we actually sort of verged on the illegal. Although I sort of have the privilege of finding it funny, because when you're a man, you can put up with these kind of things, and it doesn't manifest as sexual aggression in quite the same sort of way. Where does this end, James? I mean, I don't mean end, but where does this go in the near future? Because if you have the government really limbering up for a fight, if Ofcom basically bans X, which I think is deeply unlikely, but on paper really ought to be on the cards, that becomes a geopolitical clash with the White House, doesn't it?
Yes, and I think unfortunately that can never happen. And I think if we'd set a precedent years ago of being a bit stricter on social media companies, accepting that they are a bit more like publishers, it might have been easier to make the moves that now the situation's got quite serious. Unfortunately, these companies are now so powerful, so important in American politics, pumping money into US politics. It just becomes a political problem for us to try to deal with them properly. I do kind of hope that, I think this is immensely bad PR for Elon Musk. And I think we've kind of got ourselves into this place where we think we live in this nihilistic, anarchic world where you can do whatever you like and it doesn't really matter anymore. I do think public opinion is probably swinging quite severely against Twitter, and whether that means that we're eventually able to ban it, I'm sceptical. I do think that when we want to talk about things like social media bans for under 16s, that suddenly seems, I think, a lot more reasonable to a lot more people. And I think maybe there are some smaller victories we can claw back from the terrible morass of chaos and illegality.
Yeah, we were talking about that a little bit yesterday, and all of a sudden I can see that social media ban for under 16s really happening. I'm almost losing sight of what would be the political argument against it, because I think it's because it's much easier to do than a lot of the bigger stuff here. Let's move on. I want to talk about Nadeem Zahawi. Reform UK announced the biggest defection from the Conservatives yet yesterday. As Nadeem Zahawi, former Conservative Chancellor and indeed vaccine minister before that, joined Reform UK. The Tories have responded by claiming Zahawi had been begging Kemi Badenoch for a peerage beforehand, but she refused because he was previously sacked from government over his tax affairs. Megan, the write-up that this has got across the press today is absolutely fascinating. Generally speaking, the more reform-friendly newspapers, which I suppose I mainly mean the Mail and the Telegraph, sort of don't really seem to want to talk about it until quite deep in the book, whereas the Daily Mirror puts it on the front, basically saying rich man joins rich man's party. The Guardian has it on the front. This seems to be not necessarily something that's going to work in Reform's interest. Yeah,
I think it's really interesting because Reform are obviously trying to win over this sort of anti-establishment, potentially the former Red Wall seats, those are the seats and kind of the vote that the Conservatives lost last year. And I think bringing in someone who was Boris Johnson's final Chancellor, Chancellor for not particularly very long, doesn't necessarily suggest that they're really serious about that. It's interesting because kind of some of the policy platforms that Nigel Farage was running on last year, sort of nationalising the steel industry and things like that, were sort of geared towards that voter base, sort of slightly left on the economy. But Nadeem Zahawi, a Thatcherite Tory, isn't. That doesn't add up.
If there's a kind of Tory that Reform voters object to, and it's not Nadeem Zahawi, what is it? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
He's a sort of wealthy London businessman who was part of Boris Johnson's government. I mean, that's that, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, and we had an exclusive in the New Statesman yesterday. My colleague Ethan Croft reported that Nigel Farage isn't planning to make Nadeem Zahawi his Chancellor. So I think it's interesting seeing, we've had Jake Berry, Nadine Dorries, Andrea Jenkins, obviously the Mayor of Lincolnshire, who were all very close to Boris Johnson, kind of coming across to Reform. I think it sort of speaks to them seeing this as an opportunity to kind of get back into politics, get a bit more power again. But I think it's going to prove difficult in the long term for Nigel Farage and for Reform more broadly to sort of prove to the voters that they will need in the next general election to keep on side in order to win the majority they're kind of aiming for.
James, what did you think about this?
I kind of wonder how much it will cut through with the average Reform voter. Do people know who Nadeem Zahawi is outside of people who follow the news quite intensely? I kind of wonder if there's a fine line that perhaps Nigel Farage is treading a little better than we give him credit for, which is that Reform's appeal depends on it being an insurgent party that's against the establishment. I think another crucial thing he's facing is that people want to, when push comes to shove and they're thinking of voting for Reform, they'll want to know it's competent. And I wonder if you're thinking, I'm going to be part of government, I need some serious people around. I think if he were to hire, Boris Johnson or Rishi Sunak, that would cut through with the public. I think that's never going to happen. And I kind of wonder if people just won't notice.
Or Liz Truss.
Or Liz Truss, yeah. But people talk about the Reform ceiling in terms of polling, and there's a poll today that has them sort of down a bit, down to I think 24% or thereabouts, isn't it? I think, and they talk a lot about how the inability to break past 30%, and you look at stories like this and you think actually both sort of not just in terms of securing more votes, but in terms of evolving as a party, as a political identity, maybe there's just not really anywhere else for them to go, Megan.
I don't know. I think that it's a long time until 2029, and I think what Reform is having to grapple with is that they were in the 2024 election kind of a vehicle to get Nigel Farage elected, and now they're having to broaden out, get more MPs involved. That hasn't necessarily gone smoothly because of some of the vetting processes, and they've had sort of kind of candidates that haven't, I don't want to say dodgy candidates, that's slightly facetious, but you know what I mean, their backgrounds have kind of caused troubles for the party. So I think it's kind of, the Greens are going through a similar thing, but on the left, is when you see this massive surge, you kind of have to professionalise as a force, because you're dealing with sort of the Labour Party and the Conservative Party who have been around for, in the case of Labour, over 100 years, and the Tories even longer than that. So it's sort of becoming a more robust political force does take a lot of time and a bit of effort.
It almost makes me wonder if Nigel Farage is essentially like too conventional a politician, because you sort of think actually what's open to Reform is to, I don't know, is to be a bit more red-blooded here, to go full throttle, to be the Liz Truss party, to be the Matthew Goodwin party, to really, really embrace this kind of populism. Whereas Farage, you can see his nervousness kind of circumnavigating back to the centre, right?
Yeah, I think also part of it is that we in Britain are still in a very different political environment to the US. I think the British electorate is probably less extreme, less open to that kind of extremism. And I think Nigel Farage probably gets that he's playing a different political game to Donald Trump. I think also significantly he's just, for all that we talk about his charisma, he is just not the totally charismatic dominant figure that Donald Trump is.
Yeah.
Our politics isn't quite set up to accommodate one figure being a movement, and I think he probably is walking a fine line in a way that maybe is the correct or only option to him. It'll be interesting to see how it works out.